Hello, I'm Toycat, and welcome back to the second channel geography video. Every single country needs a few things to exist, and one of those is a name, one of those is a flag, but the other is of course a capital city. This capital city is usually defined as the seat of government, the place where the legislature meets, which is often known as a parliament, which is funny, that comes from French, parlement, a building for talking, and it's weird because who would want to talk to the French? But anyway, we define all of our buildings as parliaments, but not all of them are called that. For example, the United States has the US Capitol for their Congress. For example, there is the Reichstag in Germany, and in China they have the Great Hall of the People, but the function is always the same. It is one building where the people meet and they write laws that govern the rest of the country. This makes it the centralized seat of power. For countries as huge as China or Russia or the United States, it still has effect across the entire land, which makes it an incredibly intense building. But of course, not every country is as big as those three examples, and so their parliament buildings can be wildly different in size, scope, and even design. There's some very amusing ones around the world, and today I wanted to show you the fact that you can look at any of these using Google Maps. So my country is the United Kingdom, this is London, and the seat of government in London is Westminster. It's this big home right here, the iconic home of the UK Parliament right here, and as you can see, it is a pretty big building on a human scale. It's not the biggest parliament in the world, but it's a pretty grandiose one, and it's of course famous for this fairly large clock. I believe we call it Large Larry over there, but it is a very big building, which is why it's interesting to see that, you know, it's very, very old, yet it's very, very big. And when you compare it to the oldest parliament in the world, when we go to Iceland, according to the EU at the very least, the oldest parliament is coming from there. And the interesting thing about the Appaling, which by the way has a trillion different names, it's called like the old tag there, the EU calls it the Appaling, and if you look on Google Maps, it's the Albingshio. But yeah, as you can see, this is Iceland's Parliament House, and if you look at this on Street View, you get a very different view. So first of all, it has to be noted that of course this parliament is incredibly old. It's over 1,000 years of history, although for like 900 years of those history, Iceland was ruled by Denmark, and so not really 1,000 years of continuous history, but over 1,000 years of total history, sort of. And the interesting thing about it is just how tiny it is on a human scale. Of course, Iceland is a small country. You'd need 20 times the Iceland population just to get London, of course. So it's a very, very small country by population, but it still goes to show that a person, like, this is a very human scale building by comparison. And part of the reason for that is it's very old, and part of the reason is it's a small country, which is why it's so interesting to me that it's in Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland. And most countries which have a capital city also then have a city hall, so that city can run its own affairs. And what's interesting about Reykjavik is it's right across the street over here. And then more interesting than that is the fact that Reykjavik's capital building is, Reykjavik's city hall is super nice, way bigger and nicer, right? Which is so interesting because historic buildings are historic, and if the parliament does the job, why change it? This is interesting because, again, to go to a country of similar size to Iceland in terms of population, when you go to Malta, you can see a similar thing. You'd expect a similar sized parliament, but because it doesn't have the same huge history, because they designed it so much more recently, you get a much more interesting looking building. So these are the city gates of Malta. Of course, it's an island fortified country that's gone through a lot of stuff, so they've got very big city walls, very grand city walls, and if we go just inside of them, you can see on the right here, the parliament, and isn't this so much more modern? It looks like a generic modern building even to some extent, but it's super beautiful and fits the very different architecture of the country, right? This is the amazing thing you can do with your parliament. You can make it fit your country, which means that obviously medium-sized countries can go for very grandiose ones. An example of this, by the way, that's interesting is Georgia, the country. So Georgia is widely known for having two capitals. If you ever try to Google it, it's like, yeah, Georgia has two capitals, Tbilisi and Kutaisi. And so it's very interesting to me that if you actually look into it, the second capital building, this is the legislature building, which defines Kutaisi as the second capital. The president and the rest of the bodies all exist in Tbilisi, the main capital, but the rest is over here. This is the building, but it's actually been abandoned. They have this amazing, look at this. It looks like a bit of a snail, but in a really cool way. This looks like a futuristic snail, and I want to go and sit in there and make laws for Georgia, but I can't do that, partially because I wasn't elected, and partially because it's not the capital anymore. So yeah, fun fact you might not know, Georgia only has one capital because they kind of moved everything back from their second capital. And another fun thing you might not know is that lots of countries are smaller than Iceland and Malta, and so you get some really interesting capitals. Because not only is, for example, St. Lucia smaller than Iceland and less historic, it's the bulk of its population have moved there in the last 200 years, not necessarily always willingly, but the interesting thing about the St. Lucian population is their capital building is very different. So first of all, look at St. Lucia on a map and realize how rough these roads are until you get to the capital, where it's a grid, but it's a grid that's interrupted sometimes for Constitution Park and sometimes for a random them dominoes, so it's a weird grid system they've got going on there. I mean, I don't get me wrong, I think dominoes is important, just not important enough to interrupt our entire grid building system for. But yeah, the interesting thing here is if you look, you can see next to Constitution Park, you're going to find, okay, here's the City Hall, and then also here is the Parliament. Wow, that's very, very interesting if you ask me. Let's go look at Parliament from Street View, and okay, so this is the Constituency Council, very nice, and on the right is the Grand Parliament building, right? No, this is the Parliament building. Also, why is Street View in St. Lucia just lower quality? But yeah, this is the Parliament building. It looks like there was a fire there that they never really recovered the damage from fully. I mean, it obviously has AC, so that's nice, but you can see, like, this is the parliamentary building. Surely I have made a mistake, and that was my first assumption, so I had to really look into it, and I found that nope, this is in fact the Parliament of St. Lucia. It is a very, very small country, of course. It has less than a couple 100,000 people, but this is still surprisingly small to me. I really was quite shocked. I had to look into it more. I found the inside, and it looks like this. It is one of the smallest legislative bodies in the world. All of them sit around this big table right here in what I have to admit are very comfortable looking seats, and then they make the laws for the entire island. What a fascinating, like what a wild comparison this is to like the US Capitol, or what a wild comparison this is to even the Russian Capitol building. But yeah, this is very much the case. Some Caribbean countries go much grander on their capitals, but St. Lucia's is much more reasonably sized, or maybe the opposite of reasonably sized. But the thing is, a couple 100,000 people in a country, smaller than a lot of major cities, is not as small as a country goes. Everyone knows that the place where there's too many countries in the world is the South Pacific, and of these too many countries, so many are basically, are islands which have very ridiculously few people on them. And so a great example of this might be, okay, so we gotta go, it's really hard to find some countries in here sometimes. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna look around for Birkenbau over here. This is the capital of Kiribati. So Kiribati is one of the most confusingly located countries in the world. So that is Kiribati over there. Don't ignore the T being pronounced as an S. I'm just doing it to appease the comment people. But yeah, that's Kiribati's main set of islands over here. This is where London, Poland, Paris are, and Banana, the great cities of the world. However, the capital of, ignoring the fact, by the way, that there's no real way to get from most of those population centers to the capital, but the main island for the capital is found just over here. This is Birkenbau, and this is the capital of Kiribati. Ignore the fact that it's ridiculously thin also, and how a country can even work on atolls like this, because it really is beyond comprehension to some extent. But if you look right here, you can see that there's a fair price gas station, there's a lodge, there's a 7-day Adventist church, a Chinese restaurant, and then there's the Kiribati House of Parliament. If we look on Street View, or satellite view, you can see it's actually a fair few buildings right here. If you see the actual picture of it up front, it's just these weird looking sails, and this is the entire Parliament. It's it's extra wild to me that a country of this like scale can even exist. But even weirder is the fact that when you drive down this road, this might be the grandest building on the road, sure, you will see things like, okay, so what's down the road besides all these churches? You start to see things like, actually, St. Louis High School is very interesting to me. But as you go down the road, you start to see the New Zealand High Commission. That's quite an interesting building. Oh, it's next to the People's Republic of China Embassy and the Australian High Commission. Let's see what these places look like, because we can see that. And oh man, it's just a house. It's not even a real house. It's like a very small island house. I mean, they have to do what they can, but it's crazy to me just how remote these places must be. Also, they drive on the left side of the road here. How fun. But yeah, it's crazy to me how ridiculously remote these places are, that they're big embassies from some of the biggest countries in the world are like, yeah, it's a big house. If that was in the suburbs of a city somewhere, you'd be like, yeah, that is an upper middle class family. But on this island, it is a governmental level building, which is just wild to me. Speaking of wild things, Kiribati is not the smallest country in the world by population. Instead, Nauru is really in control of that title, and this is the smallest population for a single island. It's ridiculously tiny when you look at Nauru, and even more interesting, so just to show you, by the way, this is the extent of Nauru's territory. They have a lot of things going on their island, but interestingly enough is the fact that their parliament is on the, it looks like it's on the runway. It's technically on a side road that connects to the runway, but this is the government office and the parliament, and this is the runway for their international airport. This blows my mind. Of course they have so little land that they have to, put it it where they can, but still, look at this. They literally have like a convenience store across the street and a B&B. They have a secondary school and a primary school next to the parliament houses. You would walk, while walking between school to pick up your brother who's slightly older than you, slightly younger than you, I guess. You would end up walking past the government office. That is wild. You unfortunately, using 3D view, you can't actually look at it because the maps data isn't precise enough here, so it looks really flat. But yeah, I'm so curious about Naru's parliament, which is why I decided to look into it. So here are some fun things that I see. This is the outside of it. It's got some traffic cones across the road here because it's parliamentary. It's important. Again, it looks like a very interesting colonial building to me. And then if you look on the inside, it's even smaller in terms of number of seats than the St. Lucian Parliament. And then if you look into like, okay, well, I wonder what actually happens there. The answer is they have one of the weirdest electoral systems in the world. Looking into parliaments, by the way, it's one of my favorite things to do on Google Maps. So here's the House of Assembly for Kiribati, and you can see like, oh yeah, there's two parties, and they exactly split the 45-member structure, meaning that there's an exact tie between the Moa party and the Toa-Boaban. It's absolutely fascinating to me that countries so separated can have parties that end up so perfectly balanced. And what's also interesting to me is the fact that, some of these countries, because, obviously in the case of St. Lucia, it's a former British colony. One of the things that made me feel like, I think retaining the monarchy in some systems is not always the worst thing in the world. So, I think that if you use it in the same ceremonial way and it gives you some boost as a country, go for it. I'm not like a big believer in or anti-believer in monarchy. But what made me think real sadly about this is when you look at St. Lucia's Parliament building and then you see just up the road here, somewhere on this, you see the government house. And this government house is not for the elected government, it's for the Governor General. So can we see it? No, we can see whatever this is. So instead what I'm going to show you is this, the Governor General house. Look how much nicer this is than the St. Lucia Parliament. This is a building in the middle of the city. This is a lovely mansion on the hill. And even crazier is if you look into the Parliament of St. Lucia, which by the way, love their logo. Big fan, 10 out of 10, coat of arms. I really enjoyed that, like it a lot. But also, if you look at the system, it's like, well, the House of Assembly is for the 17 constituencies. You have 17 different members of Parliament, so there's 6 SLP, there's 3 UWPs, some independents, and then, that's the Senate. There's 13 SLPs and 2 UWPs, and so it's a very interesting system they have for government. Look at the weird circle diagram they use. But then the Senate is just appointed by the Prime Minister. 3 members are appointed based on the advice of the Liberal opposition, and then 2 members are just appointed by the Governor General based on his or her government. The monarch is meant to be ceremonial, but in St. Lucia, he gets to decide 2 of the 11 members of the Senate, which in reality never means anything. In reality, the Senate seems like a rubber stamp body if the government gets to decide who's in there, but still, 2 of those people are just decided by the Governor General. What a wild system, right? Anyway, yeah, countries with parliaments this small eventually end up with most of the members working in the government as some role anyway, which is really weird. Anyway, so yeah, there's lots of weird governmental systems around the world, and the interesting thing about these parliament buildings is they're not the smallest parliaments in the world. If you go to the smallest countries in the world, the Naurus, the Tuvalus, the in fact, I was even looking at one. It's weird. While I was trying to look for Nauru earlier, I just kept it up on Palau, which is another one of these tiny micronations in the world. But these aren't the smallest capitals in the world or the smallest governmental buildings, legislative buildings, because in some cases you find some very interesting ones. So I'm gonna get lost looking for it here. So I'm gonna be honest with you here. Tibet Parliament in exile is what we're gonna have to type in because here's something interesting. India has a parliament for India and it has a parliament for each of the individual states, but it also has a parliament for Tibet. You know that region of China that is definitely not independent, but is instead a region of China? Yeah, there's no questions about that. So there is a Tibetan parliament in exile chilling right over here. And if you look at this one on Google Maps, because the land was gifted to them by India, and India sounds really generous in that story, so you look at how much land they got gifted for, again, what would be millions of people in their country. It looks like a small apartment building on the hill here. Like, this is the Tibetan parliament in exile. Oh, it's in English too, how handy. Which is just so incredibly interesting to me. Like, I spent a lot of time looking into this one. Like, if we look at it, is this the right one? This is not the right one. This is the Tibetan part. There's so many government buildings around the world. How can you ever keep track of them all? But yeah, I think it's so incredibly interesting to look at some of these some of these places and realize that there are government buildings which exist in places this small, despite the fact that there are government buildings that take up entire city blocks, because the size of the size you as a people dedicate to your government is something you get to decide. Oh wow, like there's a Domino's here too. Man, if you're a Domino's pizza, you should locate next to the government office. It makes sense. It's not their money they're spending, and they probably get hungry a lot anyway. I'm just saying, it seems to be a strong correlation between Domino's pizza locations and governments. But yeah, it's so incredibly interesting to me to look at some of these buildings and realize that, yeah, there is a vast difference between what people decide to dedicate to their government. Sometimes it's because the size of a country means you can't put a Palace of Westminster on Tuvalu or Nauru or Kiribati. Sure, that makes sense. But the fact that these forms and functions are so wildly different is something that's worth thinking about. In the same way that some countries look at the flag system and go, we'll have a couple of triangles on there, please. Some countries look at the capital system and decide to have fun with that as well, which is something I absolutely love. And so, yeah, just a reminder that every country does even the most standardized things differently. The way they pass laws is different. My favorite example of this is actually Liechtenstein. I was looking into Liechtenstein's legal process, kind of as a fun little tangent recently, and so I was reading about this fun explanation of them, and it's like, yeah, so to be a candidate, obviously you have to have a minimum of 30 voters from the same constituency, blah, 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 blah. There's 75 candidates running there right now, including 23 women, and it's worth noting that women were granted the right to vote in 1984, and they weren't allowed to run for election before that, and so like, whoa, what a weird little tidbit in Liechtenstein's history. It clearly didn't matter to them. In 1981, women weren't desperate for the vote. They were just like, it's one of those things where countries do things so wildly differently, and it's worth considering that the way you do things might be better to the value set that you grew up with, but in some countries they have very weird different systems. Like, do you know, this is Schloss Vaduz, this is the castle where the actual king of Liechtenstein, they have a great little monarchy system going on. This is his personal castle. Oh, I can see it from above. This is a cool view. But this is his castle. His castle is, his personal castle for the king of Liechtenstein, a tiny country smaller than that of St. Lucia, is so much grander because every individual country makes their own decisions on these things. Sometimes those decisions go way, way back, but it still results in an interesting thing. This is Liechtenstein, by the way. This is like 80% of the country you can see here. It's a pretty interesting place. But we'll talk about Liechtenstein in a future video, because for now, I hope you all have enjoyed this one. But as always, second channel, don't care. Goodbye.